Part 2, Student Days. Chapter 4, Kindergarten and Primary School, Feudal Discipline at the Peeresses School. Like Eton in England, the Peers School in Japan has its significance in educating the younger generation of aristocrats. As soon as the great wave of political upheaval seemed settled, in 1877 the Emperor Matsuhito commanded a department of the imperial household to establish the Peers School, laying stress upon the importance of character building for the class which was to be the leading force in the nation. Thus, Gakushuin began its career, and today it is still directly attached to the Imperial Household Department, while all the other institutions for learning are controlled by the Department of Education. 10 years after the Peers School was founded, the Empress Haruko expressed her intention of providing education for the girls of the ruling class. This she carried out in the Peeresses School, beginning with a kindergarten where small boys and girls played together. The late Emperor Taisho, father of the present Mikado, the Empress Dowager, the present Emperor and Empress all began their studies in this institution, and many young royal princes and princesses are attending it at present. It is almost a rule for peers to send their sons and daughters here, and a few children from other families of high social standing are also allowed to enter this school. I started my schooling at the kindergarten of the Peeresses School when I was 5 years old. Little boys and girls of aristocratic birth were brought to this kindergarten carefully protected by their servants, some wrapped in soft silk, quilts, and riding on the nurses' knees in the rickshaws, as if their parents were afraid that even a soft wind might kill their little ones. The noble features and graceful manners of these diminutive lords and princesses showed their aristocratic background of many generations, but healthy and strengthening activities were lacking to them. Miss Yuka Noguchi, the principal of the kindergarten and a Christian, had been appointed to remedy this defect. She was a student of child psychology and well suited for the position. Preaching the Christian gospel to the little aristocrats was quite another matter, however. When the teachers greeted the children on my first day at the kindergarten, some hid their delicate faces behind the kimono sleeves of their maids, and some kept their mouths tightly shut. I remember I was half frightened and half curious about this new world, but as the days passed, I became quite cheerful and naughty also. 15 or 17 girls and about the same number of boys were in my class. Nearly 100 children were there together, divided into 3 classes. Several assistant teachers helped Miss Noguchi. The teachers took us to the flower garden, or let us play in the sandbox, where we built hills and waterfalls. Then we played tug-of-war under the shadowy wisteria trellises indoors. We learned paper folding, and how to make flying storks, sailing ships, blooming lotus, walking postmen, and many other shapes with colored rice paper. Also, we drew pictures, learned simple embroidery and other handwork. At a given time, we gathered in the big hall, where the teacher played the piano while we sang songs and performed simple dances. The favorite song with Japanese children of any class is the song of the temple doves. Hatopopo, hatopopo, popo tu naite asobe. Atera no yanakara orite quill. Mameo yarukara minatabayo. Tabatemo sanguni karazuni. Popo tu naite asobe. Come little doves, sing your song, hatapopo. Come down from the temple roof. Here are beans for you, little doves. Feed yourself with all the beans I have, but don't leave me soon. Play with me, little doves, singing hatapopo. The teacher paid special attention to the enunciation and the manner of our conversation. We used the traditional aristocratic vocabulary, which is so different from ordinary Japanese that it sounds almost like another tongue. I spent 2 years in this kindergarten. Then I was old enough to enter the first form in the primary section of the Peeresses' school. This meant that I and the other little girls were separated from our boyfriends, whom we have never had a chance to study with again, or even to see. But the thought that such and such men of distinction today were the little boys who often cried in the playroom at the kindergarten at my side is some consolation. I felt dignified when I first put on my red hakama skirt over my kimono, a sign that I was a student in the school proper and no longer an infant in the kindergarten. The Peeresses' school was situated on one of the most beautiful sites in Tokyo, occupying the top of a hill covered with cherry blossoms in the season. The old school is gone, in part, but there are still remnants of it across the Benkei Bashi, the ancient wooden bridge over the outer moat of the imperial palace by Akasaka Mitsuku, and up the slope through the grove of cherry trees. Formerly, there was a tall ancient wooden gate with black painted iron fittings. White walls with tiled tops surrounded the school grounds, enclosing a row of stables and large mat rooms for the attendant maids and rickshaw men, accommodations peculiar to this school for aristocrats. I walked to school most of the time, as it was only 15 minutes from my home. But sometimes Katsu, our family rickshaman, rushed me there in a swift flight, as he was always proud of his unusual speed in pulling his rickshaw for my father. He felt a little girl like me too light to notice. Racing very fast, we passed so many other rickshaws, carrying my friends, that I was quite embarrassed. I had to bow to each of them with an expression of apology for my haste. Our main school building was a red brick, 2-storied structure in Victorian style. The Victorian style was eagerly copied in the early Meiji period, with the gilded double cherry blossom, the coat of arms of the school, engraved on the front door. A wooden building, also of Western style, which had much wider windows, and surrounded a court, supplemented the main building. A botanical garden and a large wisteria garden were off at the rear, while other open spaces between the buildings were planted with huge oaks, ginkgo, cherry, and other trees. Each class in the primary section consisted of 35 girls, and half of whom had come up from the kindergarten. In the classroom, each girl sat on an individual chair with a square wooden desk before her, while the teacher took his or her seat on the platform in front of a large blackboard. Those who spent 11 years in this school, from the kindergarten through the primary and high school course, came to have a feeling of real sisterhood. Since the Puresses School was the only place of learning for the girls of this class, among my classmates were the present Viscountess Toshi Matsudaira, Marchioness Tame Tokugawa, Marchioness Aya Matsudaira, all of whom are the wives of prominent nobles. There were 4 princesses, 3 daughters of marquises, 4 of counts, 10 of viscounts, and 4 of barons. Others were the daughters of high officials, prominent businessmen, and other important people in Japan. Some girls drove to school in their coaches, but many came by rickshaw, with the gilt family crest painted on the back, and drawn by rickshaw men in black satin happy coats, embroidered with the same crest. Girls of the daimyo families arrived with maids in separate rickshaws, following their mistresses. When such a family had more than one daughter to send to school, each of the girls was followed by her own maid-in-waiting, sometimes even by a household steward, a man in western frock coat, or in a kimono and hakama. Thus 3 girls in a family would have 7 rickshaws in their grand daimyo procession. Maids and rickshaw men waited at the school until the classes were over. I do not know what these men did with the long empty hours, but the maids stayed in the quarters assigned to them, sewing silks into kimonos for their mistresses. The school provided them with a special sewing teacher. Many of my friends were brought up to have everything done for them by maids. They never carried their own books, but wrapped them with furoshiki and turned them over to their maids. When they had run about in the playground too much, and their long hair had become disorderly, they went to their maids to have it fixed, and to have their noses powdered. It was considered a disgrace to look after any of one's own affairs. The girls played together happily in the school garden, but when we did playing guest or playing princess, it was quite a complicated matter. We had a difficult time deciding whom to choose as the honorable one. When a royal princess was with us, we all agreed to ask her to be the princess in our play, but otherwise this honor became a serious problem. Each little princess and countess claimed the role for her family, and if the seat of the princess was given to a girl whose family history was less important than another's, the latter would think she was disgraced and would say, "I will leave you." The whole game would be upset by unpleasant feelings. This quarrel among the girls was in fact ridiculous. but a grave matter to the young. Among the 4 princesses in my class was Princess Aya, daughter of Prince Ayasoto Tokugawa, who would have been the 16th shogun to govern the island empire if the social order had not been changed 40 years before. There was also Princess Tame, whose family, the Shimazus, is one of the wealthiest in the daimyo class, and besides, Prince Shimazu's ancestor was in the same rank with Prince Tokugawa's before the Tokugawa shogunate was established 300 years ago. The imperial family had later conferred great honors on the Shimazus because of their meritorious work in accomplishing the Meiji political restoration, transferring the power from the Tokugawa shogunate to the emperor. How these little girls of 10 tried to decide in their playtime which family was greater in reference to their historical background. Girls from the houses of smaller feudal lords would be humble enough to take the part of ladies-in-waiting or subjects to the great lady, but the daughters of court nobles, who were mostly counts or viscounts, if not so wealthy and powerful as the feudal nobles, indeed some of them were desperately poor, would not deign to take the part of subjects to the girls from the great feudal families, as they believed that their own families made up the most refined circle around the imperial court. They had the habit of looking down even on the daimyo class as one engaged only in barbarous fighting. These feudal traditions affected the innocent minds of these young girls so deeply that they could not think of a person apart from house and rank. But they may be excused when we consider their heritage of 300 years of tradition at least. Playing princess involved plenty of bowing on the maid's part, but these little aristocrats, brought up in endless formalities, could not but be ceremonious even in their play. They bowed and waited assiduously on the princess, who, like a doll, quietly stood or sat on the imaginary throne of grass, and they bowed to each other, exchanging polite greetings and ceremonial gifts. Yet sometimes a flash of imagination appeared. Some brave youngster would take the part of a demon and fall upon the frightened ladies, who ran away screaming. A few were truly terrified, but most of the girls had real fun in this hearty shouting and running. At the start of the Meiji era, all the Japanese were declared by law to be equal, and monogamy was fixed as the foundation of the moral code. But when I awakened to social consciousness, only 3 decades had passed since these new laws had been effective, and there was almost no understanding of the actual meaning of equality. It took some time for the people to realize the significance in this new social order, as must be the case in the history of every great social change. Constitutionally, we were in a grand new era, but privately we lived in essentially the same old feudal way. Even after the honors of peerage were given to the former daimyos and court nobles, Most of them continued to behave as before, and the wave of revolution did not penetrate the walls of their mansions. Yet all was not serene even so. For instance, the girls, whose families were formerly feudal lords, living according to fixed traditions of behavior, had strange and bewildering problems to meet in many cases. The members called the head of the family Lord privately, and Count, Marquis, or whatever the title was publicly, and these lords were legally married to just one woman, but in reality there were many concubines in the house, and though social custom did not frown on concubinage, it raised grave issues for women. The lords usually divided their household into two sections, known as the outer and the inner. The outer section was where the offices were, and was formerly situated in the upper mansion. But when the upper mansions were confiscated by the imperial government at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, the offices were moved to the lower mansion, with each daimyo was allowed to retain as his residence. Usually retainers managed these household offices and formal receptions. Family councils and other business affairs were carried on in this part of the house. The inner part was the private residence, connected as a rule with the other part by long corridors within the same enclosure, but these two parts of the mansion were separated completely by the bell door, and only a selected few men were allowed to go beyond it, for the inner part was the world of women. When the lord went out, he was followed by his wife and attendant women to the bell door, where the silk-tasseled big bronze bell was rung, and the lord was received by the men from the outer section. These, in ceremonial dress, had been waiting there in a pose of utmost obedience. The ladies, in gorgeous brocades and embroidery, bowed the lord off and returned to their high-walled rear quarters. Women were never to go beyond that door except on formal occasions when they received permission. The inner part consisted of the lord's apartment, the ladies' apartments, those for elderly ladies-in-waiting, those for younger ladies-in-waiting, and the rooms for the maids who worked for those ladies-in-waiting. Okyo and Okugar, the honorable pure and the honorable impure, were the two classifications into which the young women-in-waiting were divided. The former means the virgin maids to the lords or the lady. The latter indicates the girls who, to use the barbaric Japanese phrase, were honorably touched by the lord. These girls were to attend the lord and lady for life, help them in their dressing rooms, clean, dust, and do everything for them. But when a child was born to the lord by one of these women, it was formally registered into the household and permitted to call the lord the honorable father, the superior, and the lady the honorable mother, the superior, while the real mother remained in her servile position as a maid-in-waiting throughout her life. Only after death were the mothers of these illegitimate children treated as semi-members of the family. A gravestone was given to each in the family cemetery, with the Buddhist posthumous name honorably engraved. Although the customs have since been bettered, still the Japanese wife's legal position is precarious. The official council, assigned to investigate possible changes in the civil code, is trying to give the married women the right to refuse the registration of an illegitimate child in her domicile, but nobody knows when this law will be enacted and observed. Girls of the aristocracy married with great pomp, requiring hundreds of thousands of possessions as a bride, but seldom money or land. Along with their trousseau, they brought to their grooms' homes beautifully dressed elder and younger maids. They brought their gentility and their training into the new abodes. But they never expected to receive their husband's love for long, if at all. These marriages were arranged primarily for political purposes, interweaving families of wealth and power to enhance glory or to reaffirm a steadfast connection. They were never the outcome of mutual love and understanding. The helpless wife left her fate entirely to the political abilities of the elder lady-in-waiting, whom she had brought at the head of her train of maids from her father's house, and it was this woman's business to obtain as many opportunities as possible for the wife to visit her lord's apartment. Whether the wife loved her husband or not was of scant importance, but she did have absolute controlling power over the administration in the inner household. Even the lord's most beloved, honorable and pure, was under her rule. Naturally, the lady's displeasure was chiefly aimed at those women who were the lord's favorites. Oh, how much agony and cruel struggle seethe even today behind the magnificent formalities and the thickly powdered and smiling faces of Japanese wives. I regret to say that we have not yet come far in the battle to throw off these unreasonable customs of the past. Girls who have been brought up in the midst of these struggles often take them as matters which cannot be helped, but a few like myself, whose families had particularly clear records, find it impossible to tolerate such unreasonable traditions. Never can I accept the feudal discipline of women, which, strongly surviving, teaches them to repress jealousy to an extreme degree, jealousy being the worst possible sin for a woman. The wounded pride and the suppressed passion of these aristocratic women cannot be turned into distorted forms of hypocrisy in the strong and into horrible cruelty in the weak. It reminds me of this old story of Ishimoto Maru, whose father was an honorable samurai, living with his wife and concubines, all outwardly amicable. One night, when he happened to waken, he saw both his wife's and his concubine's hair coiling and changing into serpents, which hissed and bit each other. The serpents were the embodiment of the two women's jealousy. The warrior grieved much at this revelation of secret bitterness. Finally, he shaved his head and became a monk in the Buddhist monastery of Koyasan near Kyoto, where he dwelt until the day of his death. His son, Ishimoto Maru, never having known his father, made a trip to the mountain monastery to see him, but the monk, having vowed to cast off all ties with this world, would not reveal himself, though the boy was before him, and anxious to meet his father face to face. Our ancestors wept to hear this story recited, to the accompaniment of the biwa harp. But how can I? The feudal moral code has made Japanese women's inner struggles severe beyond measure. One of my intimate friends at the Puresis school was Sumi-sama, a charming little princess whose great-grandfather was a court noble, well known for the role he had played during the Meiji Restoration in helping the young Mikado to regain his rights. Sumi-sama was just a little younger than I. The long-inherited aristocratic beauty could be seen in her features, in her long hair, which she wore hanging down her back, and in her graceful bearing. She was kind and pleasant to everybody, and I truly loved her. When she was in the 3rd class, and I in the 4th, suddenly a new girl entered my class, who was introduced as the elder sister of my dear Sumi-sama. Sumi-sama never had told me that she had an elder sister, and to my surprise, there was only a few months' difference in their ages. The sisters were dressed exactly alike, and came to school followed by a common train of attendants. The elder girl was much shorter than Sumi-sama, but there was a close facial resemblance. Sumi-sama's attitude towards her sister was cold and distant, although she observed the conventions. This aroused in me a great deal of curiosity about my friend's family. Soon I learned that this newcomer from the house of the prince was a child born to Sumi-sama's father by a so-called member of the Honorable Impure. For some reason, she had previously been sent to a common school. Recently, however, she had been separated from her own mother, formally registered, and gathered into Sumi-sama's select circle, evidently to the latter's distaste. There were many illegitimate little girls among my schoolmates. Their life appeared placid on the surface, but their inner life was always touched with tragedy. Sumi-sama's sister was never treated cordially by anyone. After the 2 girls graduated from the school, Sumi-sama was married to a young nobleman belonging to a great feudal family. Her sister was married to a man whose father was a newly created baron. Recently, the news that Sumi-sama's niece had become a member of the Communist Party, which is unlawful in Japan, and had been arrested, came as a great shock to all the nobility. But this young aristocrat communist committed suicide soon after. She was released by the authorities, leaving her mother in inconsolable sorrow. Others who know the bondage of feudal customs, still encumbering the proud aristocracy, more easily understand the revolt of this young princess, which ended so dramatically. Chapter 5. High School Years. At the age of 12, I finished the primary course in the Pierce's school and entered the high school in the same compound, which was supposed to correspond to the boys' middle school. In reality, there was a distinct difference between the two in the standard and character of learning. Boys were taught and trained to be great personalities. Girls were first and foremost taught to become obedient wives, good mothers, and loyal guardians of the family system. This discrimination was not calculated to encourage girls to independent thinking. Women were not expected to be pioneers in any enterprise. The 5 years education in the girls' high school was looked upon as the grand finishing course, so that few girls remained at school for postgraduate work. Arithmetic, algebra, Euclid, physics, chemistry, national and foreign geography, and history were taught, but we were only allowed to peep into the world of science and did not spend much time or energy on any one of the more approved subjects. Japanese literature, both classical and modern, covered the largest part of our curriculum, for as a matter of fact, well-educated Japanese citizens had to learn at least 4,000 or 5,000 Chinese ideographs, most of which are pronounced in 3 or 4 different ways and written in at least 3 styles. A vast amount of attention had to be bestowed on these. Besides this strenuous memory work, penmanship, painting, drawing, music, sewing, embroidery, and cooking were taught in both the Western and the Japanese manner. The girls were kept quite busy. Even penmanship for the Japanese is no trifle. A woman cannot marry into a good family if she reveals a sign of low breeding in her handwriting, and men will experience disadvantages in getting positions unless their handwriting is good. When distinguished men travel and stay overnight in a hotel or country inn, they are always pestered by the host for specimens of their handwriting. The innkeeper will bring white silk or rice paper and an instrument as big as a club, asking them to write some lucky verses or seasonable sayings, a note of distinction in comparison with the scribbled signs of others in the guest book. Their calligraphies will be mounted and put on the wall in the guest rooms. Nor does penmanship mean writing with a pen. Japanese writing is done with a brush, and actually it is sensitive painting, even when the brush is enormous. The artistic quality of Japanese writing reveals the personality of the writer as much as a painting does that of the artist, so that it cannot be entirely replaced by the convenient typewriter. At school, therefore, we spent hours and hours bending over our desks, and white sheets of rice paper in our hands, big and small brushes, which we dipped in India ink, writing Japanese characters, stroke by stroke, trying to present graceful and dignified ideographs. For this work we had one of the greatest teachers of calligraphy in Japan. His name was Gado Ono. It was then, and still is, almost a magic word to the Japanese. People would pay fabulous prices for a strip of paper bearing his exquisite brush strokes, expressing a 31-syllable poem. In the classroom, we had the printed models of his calligraphy and carefully imitated each stroke and each shape of a letter. The teacher came round the room, commenting on each girl's work and correcting it with his red brush. No sound except his soft footsteps was heard throughout the hour. The students were intent on learning this sacred art, and breathless over the movement of the brush. Not satisfied with the class work, most girls went to the teacher's house for private tutoring. Being a private pupil of this great master was one of the clear marks of aristocracy. It was almost the same with drawing. For this art we used, besides India ink, a dozen colors and many kinds of brushes, and along with rice paper, sheets of white silk. We had printed models of the teacher's drawings and spent many hours trying to copy not only the shape, but also the brush strokes, forming a bamboo, a chrysanthemum, a plum branch, with a nightingale sitting on it, a misty view of Mount Fuji, or a mountain cascade. Over and over we repeated these subjects, for we could not get a mark until we could draw them in the proper shape, without any mistake in the strokes. In addition to this, we had to work swiftly, being allowed only a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes for each task. Another lesson, rather unpopular among the girls, was ethics. In this class, we were taught that loyalty and filial piety are the chief and fundamental morals, that our conduct should be directed to expressing our sense of gratitude to the emperor as obedient subjects, and to parents and ancestors as faithful daughters. At the Puresses' school, the girls recited these precepts every morning before the lessons, saying, "We girls in the Puresses' school will respect the imperial family and try to be model subjects, loyal to the emperor and the empress." A Westerner might consider this ritual a religious exercise, but it was not that. It was the ritual of Shintoism, which is rather the cult of the state. Religiously, Buddhism has most influenced the Japanese mind and trained it to believe in the fugitive nature of life on the earth. Nothing of either Shintoism or Buddhism, however, served us as a moral guide in the way that Christianity serves the West. This ethics class at our school was relied upon for character building. Its substance lay in the Confucian teachings emphasizing loyalty to the ruler and duty to parents. We were brought up to think frequently of our obligations to our elders and to the emperor. We were taught what we ought to do and to be, but never did we discuss questions of personal freedom and independent thinking, or the right to be guided by one's own conscience. A familiar proverb said, "Good medicine is bitter to the mouth, so is good advice to naughty ears." Naturally, the girls disliked these preachings, pounding again and again on tired ears. To reinforce these moral obligations, we were given lessons in manners and etiquette, that we might be disciplined in modesty and reverence. Our school had a separate house, built in pure Japanese style, for instruction in etiquette. It had a mat floor and an alcove in which the essential ornaments were placed in strict accordance with the prescriptions of the Ogasawara School of Etiquette. We took off our shoes before we entered the house and sat rigid on the mats. We learned formality of every possible kind, such as wedding and funeral ceremonies, in both Shinto and Buddhist styles, the reception of guests, and entertaining or being entertained at table. The complexity of this instruction was such that we had to practice, for instance, sitting and standing positions, and 3 forms of bowing to elders, to equals, and to inferiors. As in everything else in Japanese life, these 3 different social degrees were taken into account, a most circumscribed way of living. To entertain and to be entertained at table was an affair of the most agonizing maze of rules. A formal dinner in the Ogasawara style requires the correct use of 2 or 3 soup bowls, 5 to 9 dishes, a sake cup, and a rice bowl, all lacquered black outside and red inside, served on 3 to 5 different lacquered trays, with ponderous dignity, even though the actual food they contain is unsubstantial. Every movement in handling the chopsticks and bowls, in eating and drinking, was prescribed for us, in its proper order too, even to the approximate number of grains for a mouthful of rice. We had to learn how to train the servants, their manner of carrying trays, walking on the mat floor, and sitting to offer sake or rice. In the etiquette practice hall, we girls sat absolutely silent, and took part by turn in this ceremonious play, characteristic of endless leisure and calling for limitless patience. And we were as serious as if life consisted solely of formalities, which, if carefully preserved, leave nothing more to be desired. Indeed, knowledge itself could be nothing but formality to us, who were to take it from the voice of authority as the infallible guide for the movement of the mind. We were never to criticize or doubt it. Japanese culture has long rested on the silkworm. So great is its importance as a national asset that empresses have patronized it at court, and noble women still learn to care for the tiny creatures. What in former days was a creative art has become a cult. When the season came for raising silkworms, the girls at our school, therefore, practiced feeding them and watching the entire process of silk production, from digestion to the soft white raw material outcome. All the girls in my class had been wrapped in silk from their birth, but few of them liked to handle the disagreeable worms which created it. I was one of them. I hated worms of any kind. Occasionally some mischievous companions would put wriggling white worms 2 or 3 inches long into the drawers of my desk. Once a year we were taken to inspect a silk factory, where we saw tens of thousands of the silvery cocoons boiled and untwined into silk thread by the clever hands of the factory workers, whose fingers were blistered from working in hot water all day long. None of the small aristocrats in the Peiress's school in those days ever thought of the problems of working girls. Instead, we felt deep gratitude to our ancestors and parents for the fact that we were not born into poor families whose daughters were destined to lead a miserable life. When my classmates got into the high school classes, they usually, at the age of 12, felt very grown up and ladylike, and began to wear kimonos with long sleeves. Even the dressing of their hair was different now. Girls in the grammar school wore short hair, but when they were ready for the high school, they began to let their hair grow so that soon they could wear a high puff in front, with colorful ribbons on top of the puff, letting the rest of their long hair hang down, the back tied with white cords. The longer their shining black hair, the prouder the girls were of it, and often it came down to the back of their knees. A long-sleeved purple silk kimono, a red cashmere skirt that reached the heels, and black Western shoes formed the more prevalent style for the students at the peeresses' school. The honor was given the students of this school to visit Ohama Detached Palace or Shinjuku Palace for the spring festival of cherry blossoms, and Akasaka Palace at the time of the chrysanthemum party in autumn. Ohama Palace has a beautifully landscaped garden built for the Tokugawa shoguns, who enjoyed elaborate picnics here in the days of feudal split-out. The enormous acreage of this place is largely enclosed by thick groves of old pines, but on the south side it is open to the immense view over a steep cliff of piled rocks to the Bay of Tokyo. A lake filled with green water occupies the center of the garden. The winding and twisting lines of its edge providing attractive variations in the picture. The hills and grounds are all of smooth, green turf, constantly trimmed by gardeners of the imperial household. Double cherry blossoms, rich varieties of Japanese maples, pine trees, isolated from the groves and reaching out at strange angles, with their knotted arms, are part of the display, planted according to the artistic taste and rules of Japanese gardening, so that every view of this lake has its particular harmony. The graceful cherry trees, heavily laden with pale pink blossoms, call attention to their dark gray trunks, lustrous skins between the pinkish mist, reflected on the water. At the imperial pavilion, which rests in the midst of the lake, the junior girls from the school were allowed to open their lunch boxes. The pavilion was approached by a long wooden bridge with low, round rails. Carp of golden red, black and white, more than 2 feet long, gathered with their families under these bridges to be fed. Big flocks of wild geese came here to entertain the imperial hunting party in the winter season. Akasaka Palace is situated close to the peeresses' school. Its grounds are attached to the residences of some of the royal princes. The scale of its landscape garden is bigger and the hills are more imposing, covered thickly with numerous varieties of green plants. Many of them, the oaks, ginkgos, camphors, cedars, and pasanias, are tall and broad, leaving almost no space for a glimpse of the sky. Hundreds of kinds of trees, uneven in height, each different in shape, sometimes with obliquely stretching branches, give an ever-interesting individuality to a lavish Japanese garden. Under the plants grow thick masses of low bamboo shrubs, and beneath them velvet-like green moss of several species clings to the ground. The maple is queen among all garden trees, with their minutely cut leaves like old handmade Spanish lace, with rich hues in blossom time, dark brown, yellow-brown, pure yellow, red scarlet, each separate leaf distinct in form. Maples epitomize the exquisite work of nature. These displays of bewitching foliage on the rolling hills, along the calm lake, or over the arched bridges, the water reflecting them together with the colorful kimonos and red hakama skirts of maidens, gracefully join in a composition of indescribable loveliness. Following the narrow passage paved with gray sandy gravel and a few easy steps up and down on the hills, we would reach the Imperial Chrysanthemum Show. The open spaces on the top of several hills were all taken over for the exhibition, the chrysanthemums, being the honorable flower of the imperial crest, are always handled with utmost care and respect, and all varieties of the flower were exhibited in the sheds, whose roofs and walls were made of reeds or delicately framed paper screens. The varieties of chrysanthemums, in shape, color, and style of branches and leaves produced by the imperial gardeners, were simply overwhelming. There was a type, the 16 petals of which opened out, just as in the imperial crest. There were several thousands of yellow, white, or delicate rose flowers, 4 or 5 inches long, each on a separate stalk, besides masses of small flowers, with branches 10 feet long or more, hanging down with myriads of blossoms, like a cascade. Gold or different colored strips of paper, like our poem cards, were hung from the stems, each bearing the classical name of the blossom written in beautiful ideographs, as though a flower must not have its artistic prestige overlooked in the presence of august visitors, and on the honorable occasion. It is no wonder the girls were subdued by this compelling artistry. Nevertheless, athletics as well as ethics and art had recently become a part of our curriculum, and members of the court themselves came to see us perform our exercises. Great preparations were made for their arrival. All around the wide playground were hung thick black and white curtains, as in the war camp of a daimyo. There was a temporary pavilion with reed screens and purple crepe draperies, bearing white imperial crests dyed on the front. On the platform floor of this pavilion was spread a scarlet carpet. A square table covered with gorgeous gold and red brocade stood on it, and a chair of black and gold lacquer. This was the temporary throne for Her Imperial Majesty Haruko, wife of the great Emperor Meiji. Next to this pavilion was another, set slightly lower and containing seats for the royal princesses. When Her Majesty and her retinue arrived, the Imperial Navy Band greeted them with the national song. The Empress was led into the grounds by the principal of the school, Madame Shimoda, who was dressed in a heavy black silk kimono with a skirt of the same color. The royal princesses, daughters of the Emperor Meiji, followed Her Majesty. We were deeply stirred by this noble and beautiful imperial procession. The Empress Haruko was the daughter of Prince Ichijo, who came from one of the 5 major families of court nobles. It used to be an unwritten rule to select empresses from this noble group. The Empress Haruko had been married to the boy emperor just as he ascended the throne, a typical Japanese beauty of the aristocratic type. She was also a celebrated poetess. She wrote the Song of the Diamond for the girls of the peeresses' school, and it is sung by them on every ceremonial occasion. The Song of the Diamond. Even the diamond, when left unpolished, will not shine, its light hidden deep. So man, too after, learning only, doth show abroad the way of truth, like the hand of a clock, that turneth day and night. Bend ye on learning, wasting not a second of the sun's passing. Then what can ye not accomplish, though it be hard? Water taketh its shape, still varying with the vessel that it containeth. So doth man grow to evil or good. With the companions he chooseth, seek ye those merrily who are better, wiser than ye, and together, forgetting not the whip, on your mind step diligently along the way of learning. On the day of this exhibition, the Empress Haruko was dressed in a European costume, approved by the Emperor Meiji as the court apparel to be worn on all occasions, except those connected with the Shinto sacred rites. She looked beautiful to us in this Western costume, her bonnet trimmed with a large white ostrich feather, and a veil, her hands sheathed in long white kid gloves. The ladies in waiting were dressed in a similar manner, but the 4 young princesses wore embroidered kimonos in the pure ancient imperial style, the coloring of which was all according to the color regulations instituted about 1,000 years ago when Japan produced a highly cultured society centering around the imperial court. The princesses who were in their teens wore kimonos of peach green, scarlet, and purple respectively, with big peonies, storks, bamboo, turtles, and holy clouds embroidered on them in gold and rainbow hues. Over the kimonos they wore red or grape-colored hakama skirts of taffeta of the ancient court style, looking like hoop skirts, and they walked in little silk shoes of the old court style, their hair dressed in the imperial style, hung down their backs without ornament, but the straight shining mane added to their youthful distinction. Seated in the pavilions, our royal guest watched our athletic exercises from beginning to end, Swedish gymnastics, graceful minutes, and square dances with orchestra accompaniment, and maple hunting, a dance with purely Japanese music. About 600 girls from 5 to 17 took part in the events of the day. The senior class conducted a Red Cross drill, which was quite militaristic, for it was designed to show their skill in bandaging wounded soldiers and carrying them on litters from the field to the camp. Even at this athletic meeting, which was in spirit a sort of ceremony in the Japanese mind, the girls wore long-sleeved purple kimonos, red cashmere skirts, and high-heeled shoes. Only when it was absolutely necessary did we tuck up our 2.5-foot sleeves with red or white silk bands. But in this fashion we performed the Swedish gymnastics before Her Majesty. Our tucked sleeves were cumbersome, but they were beautiful, streaming and fluttering, with the under sleeves of bright scarlet or pink adding to the color. The girls felt proud of their opportunity to perform in the presence of Her Imperial Majesty. She was to them a gracious mother, and indeed we called her the Mother of the Nation. She sat on her throne, motionless, except for an occasional smile, as she watched this ingenious play. Sometimes she smoked her golden pipe, respectfully offered by a young lady-in-waiting, who filled it each time from a gold-lacquered tobacco box. Every time she accepted her pipe, she lifted her veil to smoke it. It held just enough for 3 short puffs. Looking back through the years, I can see that the Western manners adopted by the progressive young emperor were not wholly incongruous with the graceful etiquette-loving nature of Japanese aristocracy. These athletic meetings, which the Empress honored with her presence, occurred at the beginning of term and at the anniversary celebration of the founding of the school. In commemoration, beautifully shaped Japanese cakes in plain wooden boxes were given to each student. For the November celebration, the cakes were in the form of maple leaves and chrysanthemums, or they might depict a stork, turtle, rock, or bamboo to signify the Empress's birthday. These cakes were more than welcome. For at least 2 hours, all the girls had had to stand in straight rows on the wide space in front of the school gate, waiting for the imperial procession. It was finally heralded by mounted horse guards who preceded the imperial carriage, mounted troops of the imperial guards carrying the scarlet flag of the Empress enlivened the procession. Its dramatic point was, of course, the magenta-colored carriage in which the Empress sat alone on the back seat, a lady-in-waiting of the highest rank, facing Her Majesty in a bent position on the front seat, holding a white lace-trimmed parasol. We were signaled to begin bowing slightly when the imperial flag came in sight, and to continue our bows, making them lower and lower until Her Majesty had passed before us. The girls longed to see and worship Her Majesty's noble face, but we were not allowed to look up in the imperial presence. The Empress remained an exalted mystery. The Emperor and the Empress are divinities to the Japanese, and those who had received special favor from the imperial household felt more deeply the divine grace of their majesties. Being homogeneous in racial traditions, we are one big family in the island empire, with the imperial rulers at the head. How could a girl like myself, born in the Meiji era, when the restoration of the emperor was the main political excitement, and reared under its spell, fail to be moved by the spiritual force which the emperor symbolized? One day I was talking with a cousin of mine who had been baptized a Christian and educated in a Catholic school. He was a faithful member of his church. We were talking about God. I said that the emperor was our living God, and he and his ancestors and descendants would be our gods forever. My cousin told me that there was but one God, Jehovah, and that our emperor was just a living man, although unquestionably he was a great man. "What a heathen you are!" I cried. This argument between a young girl and a young man did not reach any conclusion, ending only in hot tears, for neither could convince the other. The great emperor Motoshito, posthumously known as Meiji, or enlightened ruler, about whom our argument revolved, ascended the throne in 1868, when he was 15 years old. The great political restoration, which made this possible, he accomplished with the aid of wise counselors, later called Jinro, elder statesmen. These counselors have now passed into the mist of history, save Prince Seonji, the grand 81-year-old gentleman who joined this group around the emperor and who, still living, is today revered by all for his connection with the successful political revolt. It was a difficult undertaking for the young emperor not only to overthrow the feudal government, which had usurped power from the Mikado and held it for more than 8 centuries, but to open the land of mystery to the world. Kneeling before the spirits of his ancestors, the young emperor, 123rd Mikado and direct descendant of the sun goddess, took the oath to act upon these 5 principles. 1. To convoke an assembly widely representative and decide all policies according to public opinion. 2. The upper and the lower classes shall, with one heart, execute economic policies. 3. Civil and military officials, as well as the common people, shall all accomplish their desire, and no one shall be made to feel fatigue. 4. Harmful customs must be abolished, and hallowed be the universal way of heaven and earth. 5. Knowledge of the entire world shall be sought in order to strengthen the foundations of the imperial throne. The Emperor Matsuhito was the finest example in history of a man not only fitted for the throne, but for a great act. He was diligent throughout his reign of 45 years. He never left the capital to avoid the heat or the cold, nor did he consider personal pleasure in other respects, except a performance of the no drama once in a long while. He loved wrestling while he was a boy, and used to practice it with his playmates, the sons of the court nobles. Of course his playmates, yielding the honor of victory to the young prince, were always thrown to the ground by the august child, until he learned one day the truth of the situation. It was bad form to defeat the crown prince. He refused, I am told, ever to wrestle again. The emperor warned his people many times that they must refrain from luxury. He set them a good example in this matter, and was exceedingly anxious to prevent Western influences from demoralizing our national character. After his death, we were allowed to see the furniture and other things he had kept around him, and were amazed at their simplicity. The Emperor Matsuhito encouraged education. It was he who set up a universal educational system, which has brought to Japan a literacy higher than that of any other country in the world. It was his genuine pleasure to attend the commencement of the Tokyo Imperial University and the military and naval colleges. Silver watches were given to the students at the Imperial University on such occasions, and swords to the young cadets who had studied especially well. Although the emperor adopted the most progressive methods of administration to reorganize Japan and start her on her way as a modern civilized country, he was devoted to the old Japanese culture. He was a poet, and his empress was a poetess. He communicated his gracious thoughts to his people in verse, while his formal edicts were given out in the difficult and dignified Chinese style, not readily understood without explanation by a teacher. But in his poems he expressed himself naturally and intimately. There we learn the human side of the emperor. The old man cultivating his hillside farm alone, sending his sons to the battlefield, he gave voice to his sympathy for the old farmer whose sons were recruited for service in the Russo-Japanese War. Again he wrote, "Stirring up the charcoal in my fire bucket, I think of the cold biting in the huts of the poor." The imperial poet and poetess always preside over the New Year poetry contest, in which the public at large may compete, their compositions being restricted to the conventional verse of 31 syllables. Girls in the peeress's school compose verse for this occasion, and sometimes theirs are among those selected to be read in the imperial presence. No actual prize is given, but to have one's composition read before their majesties and the greatest scholars of the country in the exalted regions of the imperial palace is the highest possible honor for a humble subject of Japan. The newspapers print the poem and the biography of each fortunate winner. But even an emperor has his limited span of life. I was at Kamakura Beach when our family was called back to Tokyo, suddenly in the midst of the July heat. His Imperial Majesty's Go-Furay was the cause. This is something difficult to translate accurately, meaning roughly the sickness of the members of the imperial family. Soon after the emperor had attended the opening of term at the Imperial University, he felt ill, and doctors there, were about 11 of them, announced the seriousness of his ailment. I remember distinctly how great a shock this was to the nation. The emperor had never been ill in his life. The doctors issued bulletins several times a day, and people waited anxiously for encouraging news. But the news grew worse and worse. All the citizens of Tokyo worried. They suffered because their great father suffered. Tram cars ran slowly, trying not to make a noise. The populace gathered round the palace moats, under the green willows, or in the huge front grounds. During the 10 days that His Majesty was ill, more than 10,000 men and women, old and young, assembled every day, looking anxiously towards the palace beyond the white walls of the ancient castle of Yedo. We could see only the bronze roofs of the palace, the rest being hidden behind the high-walled moats, in the mystery of the pine forest. We, the infants of His Majesty, we spoke of ourselves in this way, prayed to the gods, the ancestors of Japan, to bring back the royal health. Day and night his subjects stayed round his palace praying silently. 10,000 people gathered without making a sound. The masses, whom even thousands of policemen could not hold in silence, when they did not want to keep quiet, were here, under the hot July sun, hushed with one accord in real prayer. Papers reported that many men committed suicide in the hope that their ancestors would accept the offering of a private life as a substitute for that of His Majesty the Emperor Matsuhito. At last, the great spirit of the Meiji Emperor ascended to heaven, and darkness fell upon the nation. The imperial mourning lasted an entire year, divided into 3 terms, and the girls in the Peeresses' school wore black kimonos all that time. During this period of mourning, we moved quietly at school, on the street, and even at home. We did not laugh. We played no music. Even marriages were postponed until the year was over. Nothing could be more impressive than the funeral of the emperor. All our court ceremonies of a religious nature follow the ancient Shinto ritual. No other nation possesses such an uninterrupted tradition. The funeral ceremony to which I refer was performed strictly after the manner of 2,000 years ago, except that its scale was enlarged by the enhanced splendor of the modern nation. When the great emperor's funeral took place, Tokyo and Kyoto were carried back in sentiment and atmosphere to ancient Japan. The 10th of September, 40 days after the emperor had passed away, was decided on as the day of the imperial funeral, and according to regulation it took place at midnight. All the streets along which the funeral cortege was to pass were cleaned beforehand and kept in the utmost cleanliness and quiet. Electric lights were turned off, and pine torchlights substituted. Big bundles of pine torches were burned at the center of each crossing, and square white wooden lanterns were set up along the streets, which were covered with fresh white sand on which no one was allowed to step until the procession had passed. We girls gathered in the school courtyard before dark and went to the place which had been reserved specially for us, along the funeral line, that we might pay our respects to the imperial hearse. At 8 in the evening we heard the first gong. In the distance, through the darkness, which signaled the start of the Mikado's cortege from the palace, the funeral procession extended more than a mile and numbered about 10,000 attendants, all in ancient silk costumes, varied and magnificent. The high officials who were given the honor of following the imperial hearse practiced long beforehand walking in their ancient robes, wearing crowns and lacquer shoes. Naval and army officers were in Western uniforms. Flags and streamers of gold and silver brocade reflected the torchlight. The Mikado's coffin was borne on a huge carriage of black and gold lacquer, drawn by 8 carefully selected and trained oxen. The carriage was made in such a way as to utter mournful creaking sounds when the big wheels turned. Court musicians played plaintive ancient music on bamboo flutes, with wailing tones which harmonized well with the general emotional atmosphere. We spectators all bowed low to the coffin, murmuring eternal farewell to our beloved Mikado in our hearts, but not with our voices, although quiet weeping was heard here and there. Thus we continued our silent prayer until the second gong told us that the son of the late Mikado, the new Emperor of Japan, who was already at the temporary shrine built for the purpose in a field just outside the city, had received the coffin and was now going to read his words of grief in the presence of his father's spirit. We bowed towards the shrine in what we call the distant bowing. We did not know until early the next morning, when the newspapers informed a sorrow-stricken people that General Count Marsuki Nogi and his wife, Countess Shizuko Nogi, had committed suicide at their residence, each leaving a poem and words of explanation for their deed. General Nogi was a popular veteran general at the time. The late Mikado loved him and appreciated his simple, straightforward character and his loyalty. Indeed, the emperor had entrusted him with the very important task of educating the younger generation of peers. So, for several years before his sudden death, the general had been president of both peers and peeresses' schools. The girls delighted in seeing him on his favorite horse, Kotobuki, in his khaki military uniform, with a huge decoration of the rising sun on his left breast. His gentle low voice still speaks in my ears when I think about some ceremonial occasion on which he read to us the Mikado's rescript of education, before the altar in the school hall where the sacred pictures of the emperor and empress were hung. The anniversary of the founding of the empire, on the 11th of February, and the emperor's birthday were then and remain the great national holidays, and both were celebrated at school. On these occasions, the school hall was filled with pupils ranging from kindergarteners to postgraduate students. We sat quietly in rows until the president and the dean came into the hall, leading the young royal princesses who were then attending the school. After the School of the Diamond had been sung, we bowed deeply, and while our heads were bent, the screens of the altar were opened to disclose the holy images of the emperor and empress in their ancient robes, with crown and fan. At this moment, General Nogi enacted his role. After bowing 3 times to the imperial images, he proceeded in measured steps to the platform by the side of the altar. There the school president's secretary held out a square lacquer tray, covered with an imperial crested piece of purple crepe. This, with the respect of a Catholic priest, invoking the very host, he delivered into the general's hand. Every motion of the ritual was carried out as prescribed. The general took a roll of manuscript from the tray, held it high, bowed, and then began to read. In slow cadences, he recited the sonorous character of Japanese education. Know ye, our subjects, our imperial ancestors have founded our empire on a basis broad and everlasting, and have deeply and firmly implanted virtue. Our subjects, ever united in loyalty and filial piety, have from generation to generation illustrated the beauty thereof. This is the glory and fundamental character of our empire, and herein also lies the source of our education. Ye, our subjects, be filial to your parents, affectionate to your brothers and sisters, as husbands and wives be harmonious, as friends true, bear yourselves in modesty and moderation, extend your benevolence to all, pursue learning and cultivate the arts, and thereby develop intellectual faculties and perfect moral powers. Furthermore, advance public good and promote common interest. Always respect the Constitution and observe the laws. should emergency arise, offer yourselves courageously to the state, and thus guard and maintain the prosperity of our imperial throne, coeval with heaven and earth. So shall ye not only be our good and faithful subjects, but render illustrious the best traditions of your forefathers. The way here set forth is indeed the teaching bequeathed by our imperial ancestors to be observed alike by their descendants and subjects, infallible for all ages, and true in all places. It is our wish to take it to heart, in all reverence, in common with you, our subjects, that we may all thus attain to the same virtue. We were bent at the right angle all this while, until the general finished reading the words of God, the Emperor. Then the national invocation to the Emperor was sung in unison. May our Emperor live long, till 10,000 years roll on, till pebbles to great rocks shall grow, and be with moss o'ergrown. Before the ceremony was closed, the draperies were dropped quietly to veil the holy images again. Then General Nogi gave his own oration, celebrating the occasion and moralizing on it. He was in his black full military uniform, wearing a cap adorned with tall straight white feathers. After General Nogi's first visit to the Peres's school, many old customs were ordered to be changed. The emperor feared that the Japanese people, having been victorious in the Russo-Japanese War, would lose their good habits of self-denial and frugality, and acquire a taste for comforts and luxuries. The veteran general accordingly stressed the moral virtue of enduring great hardship. We were forbidden to wear silk kimonos at school, and the length of the kimono sleeves was shortened to symbolize restraint and luxury. The beautiful square boxes of decorated sweets formally presented to the girls on each ceremonial occasion were simplified. A girl whose brother had sent her photograph to a beauty contest conducted by one of the presses, and who, fortunately or unfortunately, was given the first prize and announced in the press as its charming winner, was immediately dismissed by General Nogi as if he were turning a disobedient soldier out of his army. He preached to the girls that women's beauty is not judged by her physical attraction, but must be reckoned in terms of virtue. The girls were thoroughly shocked by this rough treatment from their military president. Soon afterwards, however, we learned through the papers that the girl who had been thus dismissed from the school was engaged to the heir of a marquis and marshal, a young captain in the imperial army. And still more surprising was the news that the person who enacted the part of the honorable go-between for this marriage was our austere President Nogi himself. Strict in principle and humane of heart was General Nogi, who stood as the highest exemplar of Bushido. Concerning General Nogi's suicide, there has been much discussion. There have been many conjectures, as well as much wonder and admiration. It may be criticized from various points of view, but to the Japanese it cannot fail to be a national witness to loyalty and nobility of spirit. It is said that when General Nogi was entrusted with the investment of Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War, he committed the error, at least in his own opinion, of directing his attack not against the key forts in the chain surrounding Port Arthur, but against the citadel itself. In the frightful carnage that followed, he lost tragic numbers of his soldiers, including his 2 sons. He had only 2. Finally reinforced at the suggestion of another general, he redirected the attack against 203 Meter Hill, which dominated the circle of the forts and the harbor itself. By that decision, the port was won, and the tide turned completely in favor of the Japanese, shortening the duration of the war. But the dead, the general thought, had died unnecessarily, owing to his mistake. He brooded over it, amid the triumphal joy of the nation over the outcome of the war. He was sad and thoughtful, remembering another blunder he had made once before in a civil war. He had no strength to face the honors and tokens of gratitude bestowed on him by the emperor and the nation. He meditated immediate suicide, for it seemed the only way for a samurai to ease his conscience-stricken mind. "Stay with me, General, at least as long as I live, for I need you," the great and gracious emperor had implored. The general obeyed the imperial command to the letter. With the passing of his master, however, the loyal servant sat on the mat in his small bare room and ripped open his body. His wife, a wife of a samurai, did likewise. I sat in my own quiet room, where I had placed the general's picture on the table, and burned incense, praying to his noble spirit without a spoken word. Then tears burst from my eyes. I cried and cried until my father came in and convinced me that a true lady must control the expression of her sorrow. This was in September, and I was 16 on the day of General Nogi's burial. A great hero he was, but he was more than that to me. He was my dear school principal, so dignified, noble, gentle, and fatherly. Soon after his death he was deified, and his old residence was made into the Nogi Shrine. He has become a great focus of national worship, a national image.